My guest today is Oscar Jeukendrup, who is a sports nutrition scientist and Ironman athlete. He earned his Master's of Science in Human Movement Sciences at Maastricht University, then went on to complete his PhD studying aspects of carbohydrate and fat metabolism during exercise. He then became a professor of exercise metabolism and director of Human Performance Lab at the University of Birmingham. Oscar has authored several books on sports nutrition and over 200 peer-reviewed journal articles on exercise and sports nutrition. He has also been the global director of the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. In 2014, Oscar started his own consulting company, mysportscience.com, where he advises teams and organizations. Oscar is currently head of nutrition for the Dutch Olympic Committee, Jumbo-Visma Pro Cycling Team, and the Red Bull Athlete Performance Center. Oscar is also a co-founder of Core Nutrition, which is an app that provides detailed nutrition plans for your races and training. I hope you enjoy the show and learn a few things that can help you with your next race day nutrition. Oscar Jeukendrup, thank you so much for joining me today on the CoachCast.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You know, you were last on, and you may not even remember, but it was about 3.5 years ago in our first season. We didn't do video back then, so if you're listening on Spotify now, we do have video available on YouTube, so you can see how good looking Oscar is. But yeah, thanks for joining me back. I think, with the race season really picking up, I think, a focus on race ready would be amazing to get your thoughts on how, and also we have a lot of coaches that listen to this podcast. So, advice for coaches when they're working with athletes, and every athlete's different, but kind of like how can coaches help their athletes get better prepared for the races that are coming up? So sound good to you?
Yeah, sounds good to me. And I think one of the things that will probably become obvious that some of the things are a lot simpler than people have often made them. Because I don't think it is always that complicated, but it is focusing on the things that really matter that is important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, certainly, there's a lot of talk around GI distress and issues. We hear that all the time around Ironman. But can some of race day issues actually begin days out from the race? And if so, what are some tips to be thinking about as the race is maybe 3 days away? Should we start actually thinking about preparing for the race, days out from the race to try and avoid any issues?
Yeah, I think you should actually start thinking about the race 10 weeks before.
Okay.
Uh,
All right. Yeah.
and this is sometimes what doesn't happen, and it can cause serious problems, because if you go into a race and you may have a plan about how much carbohydrate you're going to consume, how much fluid you're going to consume, and it may be even a very detailed plan. But if you haven't practiced with that plan, which should start 10 weeks before, then that can still be a big problem. So you need to make sure that you can tolerate everything that you're taking on race day. So start with that 10 weeks before, especially when we get talking about like how much and what you should consume. You will see that my recommendation is to actually take on, for the longer events at least, to take on quite a bit. And if you do that sort of untrained, with your gut untrained, then that's a recipe for problems. So
All right. We're diving right into the meat of this conversation right away. So I love it. Okay. So again, for coaches, for starting 10 weeks out, really, what does that mean? Is that every single workout you're working on race day nutrition? Is it a couple days a week? How do you work this? I mean, even just the question, what is the plan, right? And how do
Exactly.
you then bring that down into training as if it was an interval day? It's like, okay, how are we going to practice nutrition today? I assume is what you're getting at.
Yeah, yeah. I think step one is, what is the plan, right? So your event is 10 weeks down the line, but you need to first get a little bit of information. Like what is the event? What are the products that they have on race course? Are those the products that you're going to use, or are you going to use your own products? So those are decisions that you need to make. You need to look up the weather conditions and understand what temperature is it likely going to be? What temperature could it be in extreme cases if it's really hot or really cool? And I think your plan should be based on all of that information. Um, we developed a little bit of software, is fuelthecore.com, that can help you with this. But you can also just based on that information, come up with your own plan, of course.
So, what are the fundamentals of the plan?
The fundamentals are essentially the three things you need to look after. The first thing is you need to make sure, and this is probably the most important one, that you're fueled enough. That's number one. The second one is hydration, and the third one can really be important too, is GI problems. So you have to make sure that you can tolerate everything that you're taking. So those are the three fundamental things that you need to like look after in your plan. Now, the first one is relatively simple, I would say. It's the general advice is really dependent on the duration of the exercise. So if it's shorter, you probably need less carbohydrate. If it's longer, especially if it's longer than 2.5 or 3 hours, you can really make a difference with nutrition. So we can talk about the details of that in a minute. In terms of hydration, obviously that's going to be completely different if the conditions are going to be cool or hot. And also starting at least 10 weeks before, you should be like starting to do some measurements of how much you're actually sweating, because that will inform how much you need to drink. If you don't know how much you're going to sweat, how can you put together like a drinking plan?
Uh-huh.
And then the third factor, GI problems. This is something that you need to understand, like what you respond well to in terms of the products, in terms of the volumes. There are also some things that you can do in the days leading up to the race to really minimize the chances of GI problems.
Okay, so back to the first one there. So obviously we're talking about carbs per hour. It's kind of the big one there.
Yeah.
Ranges from 75 to 90. I assume is what you might be advising, and then the trainability of the gut, and has that been shown that I assume that's why you're starting 10 weeks out to try and train the gut to see what works and at what amounts.
Yeah. Yeah. So we know from research studies that you can train the gut really well.
Okay.
Actually, those guys in Major League Eating, right, who do eating
Right.
competitions, they know this very well. They have an off season and an on season, and they know they can tolerate a lot more in the season than they can do off season. So it's not something new, but we also know from studies in the literature that you can train how much carbohydrate you can absorb. You can train how fast you can empty solids and liquids from the stomach. And another part of that training is just stomach comfort. So a study in runners, for example, showed that if you give runners a large volume to drink, they find it very uncomfortable. But if you do that 5 or 6 days in a row, towards the end, they find that very tolerable, no problem anymore. So just in a space of 5 or 6 days training with a larger volume, you can already improve stomach comfort.
Huh.
Uh,
That's
so
interesting
yeah,
because yeah, when you think about runners, typically, runners don't tend to refuel all that often or drink a whole lot during training. So really, like, specifically setting that up within, and again, like, how many days a week are we practicing this leading into the race? How often are we practicing the race day nutrition? And as I mentioned in running, it's just not a typical thing a runner thinks about. Creating that plan during the run is, maybe something key to think about.
yeah. So especially if you don't take things normally in your training, this becomes really important. We don't really know how many times a week you should be doing this, and my recommendation usually has been just pick one day a week that you really dedicate to training your gut as well as doing your normal training. So I would pick a session that sort of mimics what happens on race day. Usually a little bit difficult because it's not, you don't normally get the same intensity, but try to find a longer training session. It's usually for a lot of runners. It's usually a Saturday run, or it's a Sunday longer bike ride. Doesn't matter which session you pick, but it's probably good to pick always the same day of the week. And then the goal is to do the training, but also to practice with race nutrition, and maybe even a little bit more than you would actually take in the race itself. So that because sometimes what you can tolerate in training is not the same as what you can tolerate on race day. It's with the stress and everything that happens on race day. It's usually a little bit more difficult to tolerate things than it is on just an easy training day.
Yeah, and what are we targeting there in terms of grams an hour?
Yeah, so this depends a little bit on the duration of the activity, but if we're talking like up to 2 hours, I would say go up to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour. If you go to like 2.5, 3 hours, then I would definitely consider taking more than that. Taking go up to 90 grams an hour. We have example of professional athletes who push it all the way to 120 or even higher per hour, but that does require a lot of practice and a lot of training. So for most people, 90 grams an hour is what I would recommend because I think it's doable. Um, but the really important message here is that you cannot achieve that with a regular product. A regular product meaning a product that has one type of carbohydrate. So you're really looking for products that are designed to be taken at these like really high intakes of 90 grams an hour.
Right.
And usually these they are mixes of maltodextrins with fructose, or glucose and fructose, or starches with fructose. And typically, I would look for if it's 90 gram an hour, you're targeting for a 2-to-1 ratio of maltodextrin and fructose, or glucose and fructose.
Well, and also, what about the absorption rate as you go through the race? I mean, I would assume, and I believe it's true, that you can absorb more in the first 90 minutes,
Yeah,
than you can in the final 90 minutes of a 6-hour event. So
yeah.
that plan needs to start from the start. You don't wait an hour and a half to start the plan.
Exactly. So yeah, so exactly as you say. So especially in hot races, where your blood is needed in the muscles, but also in the skin to cool down, it means that there's less blood in the GI tract, and absorption therefore can sometimes be limiting. So if you don't use the first hours to fuel, then you are and you start to fuel in the later hours, yeah, gut function may be reduced already, and you've missed all that opportunity of the first hours where the GI tract was working perfectly well.
Yeah.
This is why I don't like the advice that is sometimes given: drink to thirst,
Uh,
because although in a lot of situations that may work, in this sort of situation, you miss that opportunity in the first few hours because you may not be thirsty, and therefore you're not taking on anything. So personally, I wouldn't do that. I would make a plan and start fueling very early in the race.
yeah, and the big thing about race day is the pace. I mean, it's tough to do the exact race pace in training for the length of time that the race may be for. So oftentimes race day is really the only time you experience that. So, thoughts around, I mean, that's where C races can come into play. You have A, B, and C level races. And
exactly.
it might be wise to focus on a sea level race where you actually can practice that nutrition with that race pace, because it's pace seems to be the limiting factor here. If I can sit around and eat 90 grams an hour, no problem sitting down, but race pace, it becomes a whole lot harder, so practicing that in training can actually be hard too.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, the other thing that I think what you're suggesting is also my number one choice. That's what I would do. But another possibility is that you do a slightly shorter training session at a higher intensity than race pace,
Okay.
and that's also a way to train the gut. There are many different ways, of course. There's not one way that is the only way to do this. Actually, just increasing carbohydrate intake in the diet has also been shown just to be a really good way to improve the capacity to take up carbohydrate.
Huh.
And then I would also flip that around. So if you're not used to taking carbohydrate in training, or if you're avoiding carbohydrate, or you're on one of the diets with very low carbohydrate intake, that does put you a little bit at a disadvantage when it comes to race day, because even though you may want to take on more carbohydrate on race day, your body will not be able to absorb it.
Yeah,
So
you've talked
that's
about that. I've heard some other interviews with you whereby think about the diet, and it's kind of like different training days, but the diet can change up as well. I mean, you can have train low carb days, but then if that's all you do, that can affect your race day, as you just mentioned, whereby on race day you might go for all carbs. So mixing that into the training to kind of train your capabilities sounds
yeah.
like what you're advocating for.
Yeah, and exactly. It's a little bit like your regular training, right? You don't train exactly the same every day, so why would you eat the same, exactly the same every day? So I wouldn't do that. So I would really target certain days where you train the gut, very high carbohydrate. You try to have really high quality of training by fueling really well. On other days, well, let's just push the body a little bit and see how it does without the carbohydrate, and just limit carbohydrate intake, and yeah, do your training session on fat burning. Even
Yeah.
though that may mean that it's a slightly lower intensity than you could achieve otherwise, that's fine. It's training your fat burning, and what you do is you develop your engine to be able to use whatever fuel you're getting on race day. So,
Yeah. And what
so
about sodium and your thoughts around? I mean, a lot of people associate sodium with cramping, and
yeah,
if they cramp a lot, hence they need to take more sodium. Is that thoughts around that, and who needs to do sodium testing, and who needs to take on more sodium?
yeah. Some people will, but it's a relatively small number of people that actually needs to worry about sodium, I think. So if from all the people that I've tested over the years, yes, there are a few people that sweat so much, and they sweat in their sweat. They have so much sodium that their losses would be really large, especially if they go longer than 5 hours. But the vast majority of people really doesn't need to worry about it, and I think this is one of those messages that has come across. People are really afraid to not take enough sodium. I don't think you need to worry unless very long events, extremely high sweat rates, and extremely salty sweat. In those cases, those few individuals, they need to pay a little bit extra attention.
Got it. Well, if we work our way backwards to leading up to the race itself, thoughts around breakfast. What are your tips around preparing for the race, and when might you have breakfast, and what would that consist of?
Yeah. So it depends a little bit on the start of your race, I think. So because normally I would say, oh, I just get up take or start 4 hours before, but sometimes it's just not practical to do that. If the race start is very early, then it's probably to stay better to stay an hour extra in bed and have a little bit more rest and have the breakfast a little bit later. But generally, like 3 hours before is a really good time. 2 hours before is still is still okay. If you get within that sort of 2 hour, then you have to be a little bit more careful what you're eating, because 3 hours before a fairly large breakfast, your glucose would have stabilized by the time you start the race. If it's less than 2 hours before, it could be that your glucose is still all over the place. And that's not necessarily a nice feeling in the first part of the race. Like you would develop some hyperglycemia, and that's generally not recommended. Even though we've shown that hyperglycemia may not actually directly affect performance, but it may affect how you feel.
What about amount of the breakfast? Are you looking at, body weight, kilograms, to kind of calculate a range?
Yeah, if you look purely at the studies, they show like the best approach would be 4 hours before 400 grams of carbohydrates. So that's just a huge amount, and not many athletes that I know can actually stomach that on race day with a few
1,600
extra
calories.
laps. So it's a massive breakfast. Cyclists do that, no problem. Um, so that's for cyclists, it's not a problem to have a like a pre-race sort of breakfast like that. But
Yeah.
yeah, in triathlon, where you have to get up really early and yeah, just being very nervous, it's very difficult to consume such amounts. So the more practical solution is to take 200 to 300 grams, still quite a lot, and then 2 to 3 hours before.
Yep.
So that
And
would be
and
my.
leading also, leading up to the start. I mean, when I'm 60 minutes out from the start, I'm always thinking, gosh, should I take this carbohydrate drink now, or will that mess up my insulin? Am I going to now come to the start line ready for a nap? So I personally tend to kind of push it off, and I get a gel within 5 minutes of the start. Is that kind of logical thinking? And what are your suggestions that last hour leading up to the start?
Yeah, I think if you take an extra gel, or even two gels, if you can tolerate that, if you take that within 15 minutes before the start, you'll be fine, because then insulin doesn't really have a chance to get up to levels that are going to cause a problem. So by the time the gun goes, yeah, it's fine. Insulin is not, and also your glucose levels are not up, and therefore you don't get this rebound hyperglycemia in the first 20 minutes.
Yeah, got it. Cool. What about for folks that do experience a lot of GI distress? What are kind of the top 3 tips you could advise them looking into to try and avoid issues?
I think the best way to avoid it is by paying attention to what you eat the days before, the 2 days before,
Okay.
especially. I think fiber, especially, seems to be one of the factors that really influences GI problems. So if you're really prone to developing those problems, just remove fiber from your diet as much as possible those 2 days before. Um, that would be one. I think the breakfast before, again, like low fiber, low fat, low protein. That's also factors that even in research has been shown to cause more stomach problems. And then the other factor would be just practicing in training what you're going to do in the race, so that there's no surprises really for your body on race day.
Yeah, absolutely. And then moving into like stage races where you have another race the day after, or multi-day race, tips for when you do cross the finish line. What should you be thinking about in terms of preparation for the next day?
Well, first thing would be start fairly soon after. So you cross the finish line, and then that's really where you need to already start thinking about next day. So we also know in that hour after the finish, that's a really good time for your body to resynthesize glycogen. So start with carbohydrate. And I think a lot of athletes think of recovery as, oh, we need to have protein. And to some degree, that's true. But most of your recovery is going to come from carbohydrate. So it's protein has a very slow effect. It takes like a long time for protein to actually result in like repair damage and all those things. That's a process that takes days. Whereas you have to race the next day. So you need to make sure that hydration is in order, which usually, unless it's extremely hot, is not too difficult to do. And then it is making sure that you have enough carbohydrate. Um, the exact amount of carbohydrate, I don't think it matters that much. The recommendation that we usually give is 1.2 grams per kilogram body weight per hour. Um, but that's really based on studies where you had to perform again 4 hours later, 5 hours
Mm,
later. So
right.
if you have the like almost 24 hours to recover, I wouldn't worry so much. It doesn't need to be those. Maybe the first hour I would take that amount, and then after that you can almost go back to like fairly normal refueling
Hmm,
and having normal meals.
right. Um, I'd love to hear about what you're actually doing these days. I mean, you kind of left academia behind. Some of your consulting work. You're still working with Jumbo-Visma. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And there was an article actually that came out today in Vela News with one of the directors, and he mentions the food coach.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear, your thoughts around what you developed, help develop there, for what purpose, and what it actually does, and how does it help the athletes.
Yeah, so Food Coach is an app that essentially helps the riders to eat well and eat according to their needs, eat according to what they're doing on the day. And the background to that is a little bit when I started working with the team in 2017. We started to think about how can we improve the fueling of riders. And during the Giro d'Italia, I prepared a spreadsheet to help calculate the energy needs, carbohydrate needs. And initially, I did this with two riders. And I would then I would sit in England. I wasn't actually even in the race, but I would sit at home, do these calculations, and then send the information back to the chef, who would then sort of portion the meals and for those two riders. Incredibly sort of time consuming to do this. So that's why I could only do two riders at the time. So then Jumbo, the supermarket, they had an app already that used the recipes they had in their database and tried to figure out like what recipe would be best on what day. So we sort of combined those effort, and they developed the Food Coach app that really took the algorithms from my simple Excel spreadsheet and turned it into an app that the writers could actually use. And then when we started sort of the next season, it meant that the riders had to weigh whatever they were eating, and I was a little bit concerned that it would last a couple of weeks and then they would get very tired of weighing their food every day. But here we are, several years later, and several versions of Food Coach later, and they're still weighing it because they can feel the difference.
Wow. And they're pulling in data from TrainingPeaks, I take it, right after the race
Absolutely, absolutely.
or
So
training.
as soon as they cross the finish line, so what really happens in races? So we make some predictions of what's going to happen in the race, and we make the predictions for a tour, for example, in May time. So they're really just predictions, but the predictions are also different for every rider because every rider has a different role on different days and so on. So that goes into the algorithm and the calculations for each day. But of course, on race day is always a little bit different than the predictions, of course. So as soon as they cross the finish line, they press the bike computer and the data gets uploaded to TrainingPeaks, and then that data gets pulled by food coach. And at that moment, we have the actual data. So not just like the predicted information, but actually the actual data. And we can recalculate and then adjust the evening meals. So this is, this is how we work now. And it's one of the findings is um, that like weights, for example, are really more predictable than they were before. Whereas normally in stage races, you have weights going up and down for various reasons, and you never know quite why. But now it's definitely become more predictable. So.
Hmm. And then those algorithms, are they fine tuned to the individual? I mean, you put a rider in the lab and do a lab test, figure out carb versus fat oxidation. But then here they are doing a 6.5 hour stage. You didn't do a 6.5 hour test in the lab, I assume, on every rider. Um, and every rider, what is that variation between riders? I assume,
Yeah,
the
there's quite a lot of variation, of course, between riders, and this is something you need to figure out for each rider. But the algorithm takes care of a lot of it, but you
yeah,
also need some other inputs.
yeah. Um, I guess kind of wrapping up things, you've done a lot of research, but if you had the perfect grant right now, what would you want to study? What is still kind of like a black hole or big question? What would you love to see research done on?
Um, well, I think the one thing, a lot of the research that we have is based on endurance exercise at fairly constant intensity, and this has to do with the fact that we can measure those things easily.
Mhm.
um, Actually, as soon as it becomes extremely intermittent, the exercise, it's very difficult to do those measurements, and therefore the information we have about that type of activity
Mm,
is by extrapolation and not because we do have the measurements. And I think this is something that we could still learn a lot about, like more intermittent exercise, not just in endurance sports but in general. So it's
absolutely.
yeah so
Yeah, I think about that, when you jump in a mountain bike stage race or a road stage, you're facing a 5 hour day, but you start out of the gun 100% racing for the single track, and she's like, how do I calculate that, into my
exactly.
nutrition plan when I don't even know the tactics of the day, what's going to happen, so it's kind of like changing on the fly and working with your experience, but then science still has to try and catch up with, as you just mentioned, all of that, all of those unknowns.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and of course, we make decisions now on the best knowledge that we have available. But at the same time, sometimes the more you know, the more you also realize how much you don't know, and that's
Well, that keeps us going. That keeps us going. I'm glad we don't know
absolutely,
everything.
absolutely.
Hey, you mentioned your app, the Core app. How can people find that?
Well, the website is www.fuelthecore.com. Very soon, that's going to change. We're going through a rebranding, and we'll have a new name, Yabadoo.
Yabadoo.
But for now, this is the website, and you can just get a free plan, so you can try the software. You don't have to pay for anything. There is a premium version, and then the advantage of that is that you actually get access to like 2,000 plus products that you can choose from.
Hmm.
So you can really tailor it to the products that you would use.
Yeah, or the courses or the races providing on race day.
Yeah, so core. We have a lot of races pre-programmed
Oh,
in core, and
got it.
so it will tell you what is available on, and you can do the planning with the products that are on course.
Awesome. Yeah, it's a good resource for coaches. Also, what My Sports Science, is that a lot of where you publish kind of your research findings and great infographics and good resource for coaches there as too as well.
Oh, I just stopped for a second.
Oh,
Cramping.
cramp. We're keeping this. You know,
Fair
you
enough.
need some sodium.
I do need sodium. Where's the sodium? Where's the
What did you
sodium?
do today? I mean, what kind of workout did you do today?
I just did a Swift session. This is one of those things where you do a very quick Swift session in between two meetings. And
Nice. Yeah.
you know you can't actually complete it within the time, but
You're
yeah,
dehydrated.
that's it. That's it.
uh, so
But
yeah,
yeah,
is it my science, my sports
yeah, my,
science?
my
Sorry.
sports science is a website that I started to communicate about science, because there's so much confusion in the world of sports nutrition. I guess also in the world of training, but in the world of sports nutrition there, or nutrition in general, everyone who eats and drinks these days seems to be an expert in nutrition. Shares their views on it on social media, and that means there's so much information, and a lot of it is opinion, some of it is expert opinion, but it's very difficult for athletes to work out what's real and what isn't, and what is based on evidence and what isn't. So
Yeah.
the purpose of my sports science is to explain this, like explain the evidence, and separate the, I guess, the facts from the fiction. That's what I try to do.
Yeah. Super. Thanks for putting that resource out there again for coaches. That's great. You can, find, search, filter different topics and maybe pass them along to your athletes as a
Yeah.
little sage advice from Oscar Jeukendrup. So thank you so much. Hopefully see you. I don't know. Are you going to go to Hawaii?
I may, yeah, there'll be. It's been a long time, so I would love to. I'd love to go. So
I'm
yeah,
looking forward to it myself. So hopefully I'll see you there in October. But thank you so much, Oscar. Some great advice, and look forward to seeing you down the road.
thank you. Pleasure as always.